Hey folks, Kostya here. So I recently traveled back to Europe to play another two tournaments. The first one was in Portugal and then the second in Italy. And yeah, I recently actually just got back to St. Louis and I've gotten settled in, but I figured it was time to do a video on these events and recap some of my games and performances and so on. So in this first video, I'll be recapping my first tournament of two, the one I played in Portugal, the 2024 Maia Open, which took place in Maia, Portugal. And yeah, this was a 9-round tournament, full-on classical event. I was invited as one of several streamers for this tournament. Super fun event, great conditions. The organizers were fantastic. They really ran a great event, so I would wholeheartedly recommend this tournament to people to play in the future. And yeah, for me, it was another tournament I wanted to do well. There was a number of good players in the event, so definitely felt like it could be a chance for me to gain some points. If you missed my previous video on this channel, we'll link it down below. I did a video about my previous two tournaments in Europe. I played one in Corsica and then another in Spain. So if you want to catch my recap of those events, that is available on this channel. But for this video, I'll stick to the event in Portugal. Like I mentioned, it was a 9-round classical tournament. Time control was 90 plus 30 for the first 40 moves, and then an extra 30 minutes added after move 40. So I won't spoil the result just yet. Rather, I'll go through the games, take you guys through some highlights and some low moments as well, just some of the more instructive moments perhaps. And then afterwards, I'll talk about my overall result in the tournament, my performance, and some key conclusions and takeaways. Okay, so in this first round, I was paired against, I believe, a Spanish junior whose FIDE rating is around 2034, but okay, definitely felt like he was underrated, like most juniors are these days. And yeah, we got this position out of the opening. I played like my usual ready system, double fianchetto. And here, actually, the game definitely got very interesting because I found this move, knight to e5, which probably wins material for white because I'm hitting the rook and the knight on c6. Then after knight takes e5, bishop takes e5, I've got this pin along the diagonal. So I think my opponent saw this one because he had queen d7 in mind. And then I can't take on d5 because queen takes d5. And then I have to cover the mate threat, and black wins 2 bishops for the rook, so that would be bad. But I do get f4. And I thought with this move that I'd be winning the exchange, which I think is correct because the rook isn't going anywhere. But surprisingly, after f6, I take, pawn takes, because if queen takes d5, there's e4. So pawn takes, bishop a1, and d4. All of a sudden, it turns out that black just gets like a ton of counterplay for the exchange, which they definitely underestimated from afar. So apparently, okay, according to the engine, what I should have done was retreat with bishop f4 with a similar idea, like the rook is not really going anywhere. Like if rook f5, then actually I don't think white wins the exchange here, but we can take and go e4, and then the rook is forced to f6. We get d4, and yeah, it's a very ugly position for black because like the rook is out of play. So engine actually likes that more than f4, which does win the exchange, but yeah, ends up giving black just way too much counterplay on the diagonal. So this one ended up getting out of hand. I go rook e1, takes, d3, rook d1. Now black finds c4. And at this point, I thought I was just like in trouble because, now black is starting to take the queen because bishop c5 check is coming in. So if I take the pawn, for example, black takes here, I take, black gives bishop c5 check, I come up, bishop takes e4. If I put my king on h1, it would have been mate, king h3, and then bishop f5 check at the end picks up the rook. Black is up a piece and winning the game. So here it actually gets very dangerous for me, and I realize like things have gotten totally out of control. A5, bishop c3. And yeah, I was just trying to fight back here, queen e3, rook e8, rook a1. I decided to go for the a file. And yeah, at this point, things get very messy because black plays queen d6. The queen, I feel like at one point can come to c6 as well. And the e pawn is going to be a target. So both of us were in a bit of time trouble. I decided to take a risk and go bishop e5, sacrifice this pawn, and then go rook ea1. And I just felt like, yeah, the character of the game wasn't going my way, so I needed to change something. And I thought it was a pretty reasonable decision because all of a sudden, black is under a lot of pressure. The bishop on a8 is hanging, and there's a lot to look at. Like, for example, a bishop c5, which looks very tempting. White can take on g7. Let's say king f8, bishop d4. And I think this is actually very good for white because takes, queen takes. I've got queen f6 check, and yeah, that's a problem. So this one isn't working for black. And then black might also be tempted by rook takes e5, which ends up happening in the game. Because if I take back, of course, there's bishop c5. But here I take on a8, and the bishop on f8 is pinned. And yeah, I realize that here that my two rooks are actually very, very strong. And black's pawns, although they also look strong, are kind of slow because white is getting in and getting a lot of play. So rook e6, I go queen d4. And now my idea is I'm actually looking for possible sacrifices on f8, followed by queen d5, or bringing the rook to 8 in case of king takes. I also want to just advance my pawns with e5, f5 and start getting a lot of counterplay. And in the meantime, black's pawns are very slow. Actually, they're not moving anywhere. So the game ended here, actually. Black played rook d6, and I realized I can just take on f8 and win the resulting queen and rook endgame because black's king just ends up getting hunted down. So check, rook a7, and yeah, there's nowhere to go. If king e8, then queen e5 check, and the queen is getting in either with queen e7 or queen b8, and then this one was just takes and queen g5 mate. So this one ended up, okay, getting away from me, but then I managed to turn it around. At this point, I think black had to play the move d2, and then the position would have been very much unclear, because black has ideas to promote on the first rank, and yeah, I can't exactly take here, and okay, it would have been messy, but yeah, that was so that was just round one, but I managed to win. Round two, I'm playing black against another like expert rated player. This one I would say went a bit smoother. It was started off as this kind of like close Sicilian position. White played rook e1, and I would say actually instructive moment came here in the opening. I played this move d5, which looks like it makes sense according to my setup, but then white could have played e5 here. Actually, this would have been kind of a nice version of the King's Indian attack for white. Bishop f4, h4, and white can also play for like c3, d4. And actually, the bishop on g7 here, I feel like is not so good. So yeah, my opponent didn't punish me. He goes knight d2. So instead, what I should have done was either play e5 here or d6 or just castle, and then actually just go e5 myself and take the space, maybe go either d6 or d5 in the future. So yeah, I went d5, knight d2, castles, h4. Once again, I think e5 was kind of the best move. And at this point, I realized, oh, you know what my issue is? Like, I keep getting hit with this e5. Maybe I should go e5 myself. So finally, I play e5, and I think this was good because now, okay, white can take. We get knight takes d5, but now black got some space. And I was trying to figure this out during the game, but this is like a reverse fianchetto King's Indian, where white has gone in some extra moves because white is playing with an extra tempo, and then also I played like e6 and e5 in two moves. But at the same time, white has this extra move h4. Like I was trying to figure out, like, is this a good version or not? And I thought, like, actually this is quite reasonable for me because normally the King's Indian side hasn't given up this g4 square. Like they can play the pawn to h3 or to h6 from black. So I thought actually this is not so bad, and I think that was more or less accurate. So knight c4, hitting the e-pawn, I go bishop to g4. Could also have played f6 here. But anyways, my position gets quite good here. White goes knight e3, and this ends up being a mistake because this allows me to take, bishop takes, and okay, b6 here. I think black is already doing quite well, but I liked my decision in the game too. I go e4, just opening up the bishop on g7. Then after white takes, bishop takes b2. My point is that I've just kind of split white's pawns on the queen side long term. And I have ideas of like queen takes d1, rook d1, knight e5, kind of unpleasant, like playing against the pin. So white has to deal with this too. So rook b1, bishop c3, rook f1. Here I played b6. I think actually Engine was saying it would have been stronger to just go for the endgame. Actually, no, b6 was fine. Then after rook to b3 as in the game, I think at this point taking on d1 was the computer's choice. And then either knight d4, which is, okay, very tactical, or bishop g7, which is the simpler choice. And then, yeah, actually, this is the kind of endgame I was looking to get, where black can play for bishop e6, and white's queenside is super weak. I have knight b4 coming, and yeah, I think black would have quite a nice advantage here. Yeah, I decided to just go bishop g7, just like giving white the option for the endgame. He goes queen to c1, queen e7, and maybe the advantage here is not so big, but it ends up being difficult for white to play. He goes knight d2, and this is already bad because this is giving up the d4 square. Instead, I think if he plays like rook e1 or just like very patient, then objectively he's probably fine, but still I was pretty happy with my position. So knight d2, and then I end up winning this game pretty smoothly. f4, knight d4, takes, pawn takes, e5, and now d3. And basically I'm just trying to open lines for my pieces because now I have the bishop pair, and white's queenside pawns are weak. I have nice files for my rooks. And so yeah, I just thought I have to play active here. So I like how I played this part of the game. f6, just opening up more lines. Takes, rook takes e6. Is kind of anticipating, you know, he might go knight e4, but then I have rook e6 as a nice response. He goes king h2, getting out of any checks. I did the same, king h8, knight e4, rook e6, and yeah, all of black's pieces here I just felt are very well placed. Now knight f2, okay, I can go bishop e2, but I liked my decision here as well, bishop f5, just defending the pawn, and then I got rook e2 coming next in the position. So rook d1, rook e2, and yeah, it was all over here. Knight d3 takes, if rook takes d3, there's queen e4, which ends the game. So white tried c4, but yeah, it's all over. Rook takes, queen e2, and white resigned as the bishops are just coming in. King h3, there's bishop f5, and if king g1, the bishops deliver the nice mate here. So 2-0, I was pretty happy with this one. I felt like I played reasonably well. Then on to round 3. This was a bit of a disaster out of the opening. I started with c4. I won't get into the details of how I chose this move, but yeah, g3, c6, I went d4 here, and I got into this variation, which is pretty theoretical, and I actually just don't really know very well. Knight c3, d5, and it's like some kind of reverse Sicilian, c3 Sicilian with an extra tempo. g3, that's also not very useful for white. But yeah, basically I went into this like not really expecting it. I thought my opponent would play something else, and I wasn't prepared on the theory, so I ended up just kind of winging it. White has different moves here. a3 is a move, kind of stopping bishop b4, bishop g2, I think is a move as well. I took on d5 and played queen to b3, which is a bit naive, honestly, because, you know, of course black will have something here. It's unlikely that their best move is just going to be knight f6, allowing bishop to g5, where clearly white's position is good. And I just sort of like overlooked that like black is going to have like a tactical response, knight c6. And yeah, knight c6, and now black is doing just fine. The point is if I ever take on d5, black will take on d4. And yeah, I didn't want to go for these complications, and I played e3, and then I realized like my position is just bad. It's like I'm playing French at this point with, you know, this extra move g3 that's like possibly just hurting and like weakening my position, and already black is better. And so yeah, not exactly what you want to get against, you know, low rated player, especially someone who's like 2150 and strong. Anyways, I go bishop d2. I try to make the most out of my situation, and here opponent goes bishop b4, and it took me like a few seconds. Like I kind of glitched because like I didn't realize that like what had happened, because I played this move bishop d2 actually to stop knight b4, because I thought knight b4 is an annoying move, looking for like knight d3 check. But here I would have the typical tactic, knight takes e4, then I take on b4 with an extra pawn. So then when my opponent played bishop b4, somehow I didn't like I didn't immediately realize like what's going on. Of course, I spent a second, and then I noticed like, oh, I have knight takes e4. I have the same exact tactic, and I looked at like, are there any tricks that black can pull off, but didn't really see anything. So I took on e4, and yeah, I realized my opponent just kind of blundered this. So a lucky break, because now white gets a pawn. Knight takes c4, bishop takes b4. And funnily enough, black could get some compensation here with a5. With the idea bishop a3, a4, and then looking for queen a5 check. So white would have to play like queen b5 to stop this. And then rook a5, queen goes back, and b5. And like, yeah, this would be kind of tricky for white to deal with. But yeah, fortunately, the opponent didn't find this idea. He starts with queen f6. But now it's different because queen f6, okay, it's very logical, like hitting f2, and it's not so easy for white to defend this one. But I do have this move f3, and the queen loses the access to the a5 square. So black kind of went a little bit too committal with this queen f6 move because now f3, the knight's under attack. And here black goes a5, but now this is completely wrong because now my bishop can draw back to a3. So I actually feel like my opponent just kind of tilted after blundering the pawn, which is totally understandable because like, okay, here after 8 moves, he has like a great position, you know, playing a high rated player. And then he makes one just like kind of careless move, bishop b4, hangs a pawn. And it's like, so I totally get it. I feel like he got frustrated here. And yeah, just he wasn't playing his best chess. So queen f6, f3. Now what black should do is probably just like drop the knight back with like knight to g5, and or take on b4 first, and then come back like knight d6, something like this. And okay, I might go bishop b5 check. I might go bishop b2, bishop d3. I think white has a lot of moves. I'm up a pawn, but it's like it's just one pawn, and the game continues. Black will castle, get the pieces out, and yeah, white will have to work hard to convert it. But after a5, which is this like, you know, ill-advised counterattack, bishop a3, all of a sudden I'm keeping my bishop on this diagonal. Now black can't castle. So in addition to the extra pawn, black's position is kind of ruined. So knight to g5, because knight's under attack. If knight d6, I'm going to take on d5. And here, if I take on d5, there's bishop e6 and some counterplay against f3. So I decided, you know, I don't need that. Let's just go bishop e2. I just want to defend the pawn and then kick the knight back with h4. And now it's awkward for black because h4 is a threat. Queen takes d5 is a problem. If bishop e6, that hangs b7. And yeah, black doesn't have any super comfortable moves. I was thinking like queen f5 he could try, but then minimum there's h4, knight e6, and like g4, and yeah, and then I think I'm just taking on d5 anyway. So at this point it's basically over. Black played rook b8. I kicked the knight with h4, knight e6, queen takes d5, and yeah, opponent resigned because this is now he's 2 pawns down. He still can't castle, and position is really bad. I'm ready to go bishop d6 or queen d6 or get the knight out, and yeah, 2 pawns down and just didn't want to play anymore. Totally understandable. So 3-0. Started off 3-0. Felt really, really good about that. Although the games I would say were not the highest quality, as you know, I was in trouble like in 2 of them already. But anyways, the result was definitely nice. Moving on to round 4, I was paired black against Grandmaster Nigel Davies, who, like me, used to be higher rated. Now, actually, we had the same rating going into this game of 23-28, but of course his peak rating is much higher. And yeah, I didn't have too many issues in this game. I was playing black. We had type of I forget if it was like a London system or a Tory attack. It was basically like a d4 sideline against the King's Indian. And yeah, we reached this pretty equal endgame where I thought things are basically balanced. I can't really do much with my pieces. I don't really want to trade on d4. There's this tension. I think neither side really wants to trade and help the other side out. Neither side can really do a whole lot. So yeah, just kind of equal. But at this point, he took on e6, which definitely started to give me some chances because now I take back with the bishop. I could have taken with the pawn as well. He trades bishops. I go fe6. And here, actually, I thought I could play a little bit as black for the win because I just felt like in the long run, he has a few more weaknesses on the queen side, and maybe I can maneuver around with the rooks. So now he goes c4. I think kind of an unnecessary move. In fact, we were thinking after the game might be a mistake. Maybe white should just play like f3, e4 instead. Because after c4, all of a sudden black gets a lot more room to work with. So like rook a4, b5, I played b6 here. Could have also maybe played like rook b4 and c6, but I played b6 to hold him at bay, and now I just want to come in with rook b4, rook b2. So f3, rook b4, king d3. And at this point I realized rook b2, rook c2 doesn't accomplish much. White can just kind of sit. I was trying to figure out how to break through. Eventually I felt like c6 is my only chance here. So takes, rook c2, rook b2, rook c1. White is just holding steady. Rook c5, bishop e1. And now white is probably ready to go bishop c3 at some point and trade off the bishops. If we got some kind of rook endgame, I felt like I would have no advantage. I felt like my only advantage is that my bishop is maybe stronger. So I decided I kind of have to try d5 here. It just felt like the only chance. So takes, king e4, I give one check, I repeat once, and then I played rook d7 here. And basically I felt like I have one kind of idea in the position, which is to try to get b5 and b4 in, because I do have 2 versus 1 on the queen side, and so if I can somehow manage to break with b3, I can potentially win the game with my passed a pawn. The only question is, of course, how to execute this, because when I go b5, b4, white can trade rooks and then take on b4, possibly with check with the bishop. So I was trying to figure this out. I parked my rook on d7 to cover the 7th rank. White starts advancing on the king side. I go b5, h4, and now I felt like I wasn't quite ready to go b4, but the thing is, if I move my king somewhere, white gets counterplay with the rook. So king f7, there's rook c7. King e8, white can give check and then go back rook to c7. So it's actually hard to find a good square for the king. And I considered actually sacrificing the pawn with b4, because on takes, bishop takes b4 check, let's say king goes somewhere like d8, white would have to take care of this pawn, go like a rook to b1, and actually I thought there's some potential here, like rook c7, rook c1 ideas, and so on. Eventually I realized I don't have to do anything right away. I can just play h5 first and just kind of fix white's pawns on the dark squares, which I thought was kind of clever, g5. And now I pushed b4. And so actually it's kind of important. This was like move 38. We're both in, actually I'm in more time trouble than my opponent. I think he had time, but he was definitely kind of playing at a bit accelerated of a pace. And here I realize now is the exact moment to sack the pawn. So he takes, bishop takes b4, king e8. And yeah, my idea was to go for this endgame, like rook b1, rook c7, and I'm threatening rook to c1. I thought bishop d2 here is most likely. And yeah, then my long-term plan was to just go like rook a7, pick up the a pawn, and then just play with this b pawn, which is very unpleasant for white. In fact, I also thought maybe one day I can go rook a1, force white, white will get the king back in time. But at some point I go rook a1, I bring my king in first. Somewhere to c4, I go rook a1, I trade rooks, and then I go king d3, king e2, and I just collect the king side. Basically, I treat it like an outside pass pawn situation, which it basically is. So I felt like there was actually very good winning chances here. So this was kind of like my idea. Looking at it with an engine afterwards, I think it was actually winning. It's not easy. Black has to be precise, but with best play, I believe it is winning. Like just walking the king in, then going rook a1, trading rooks, and yeah, king comes in at the end. But still would take some precision. As it happened, my opponent goes bishop a3 here, which I had seen from afar was just a game-losing blunder, because now black has rook c4 check, king d3, rook c3, and I pick up the bishop. So on rook c4 check, he just had to resign. Easy thing to blunder, because you don't realize like, oh, actually the king has no squares, you're forced back, and then rook c3 and taking. So the game actually had kind of an abrupt finish, but I thought this was this nice breakthrough. And at this point, yeah, I thought rook c7, if bishop d2, rook a7, I thought I would have good chances here. Of course, I should say on b4, well, I didn't have to take on b2. You guys might have seen this was double question mark move. It turns out white could have kept the situation relatively equal with a move like rook c4, rook c8, with the idea of playing against the enemy king and actually getting behind the pawns with rook b8, rook a8. So for example, b3, white could take, rook takes, rook a8, And yeah, Compy says this is equal because it's hard to push the pawn forward. Other rook can come down to c8. I can understand why. Okay, things would have still been very complicated here, but yeah, obviously I realize like it's likely a drawn endgame, but you know, you still try to win and try to break through. And I felt like this was my best chance. Opponent went for it, and yeah, ended up going our way. So 4 out of 4. You know, just beat a grandmaster with black. Feeling great at this point in the tournament. Going into round 5, I was playing against one of the top seeds in the event, Grandmaster Victor Mikhalevski. And yeah, we had a sharp King's Indian. We ended up in this position after, very complicated battle in the opening. And at this point, black goes f takes e4. I should just say, like, the evaluation of the position, it was hard to judge during the game. I feel like things are just very unclear. Material is still equal. We're castle on opposite sides of the board. A big decision that was made earlier is that I gave up the dark square bishop on c5 in order to kind of, let's say, calcify black structure and prevent him from getting a lot of counterplay on the queen side. And now white's idea is to kind of play on the light squares. So here he goes f takes e4, and unfortunately I made a pretty rash move here, knight takes e4, just kind of recapturing. What I should have done was actually try to take back in a more clever way with the move knight to d2, so that I can bring the other knight to e4, where I think then white would get kind of a better grip on the position. I considered this, and eventually I decided like I would rather take with this knight so that I can bring the other knight to g5. I thought this is more active, but knight d2 definitely was the way to go. And the reason for that is because of actually what happens in the game. After knight takes e4, knight takes h3. And black is able to grab this pawn. And normally this is not a tactic that's like supposed to work in these kinds of positions, but here black does kind of get away with it, because if I take the knight, there's rook takes f3, and then the rook can come back to f4, and black gets a lot of pressure against e4. A lot of times move like g3 is supposed to be pretty annoying for black, but here black can take on f3, let's say bishop takes h3, and bishop f5. And I think this is totally fine for black, because if I trade gf, I have to move my knight. If I'm allowing e4, then that's just devastation with queen coming to f6. So here black would be at least okay. And yeah, so that's why knight d2 here would have been better, because basically it doesn't allow this knight takes h3 shot. Then I can, take back on e4, eventually prepare g3, and I get exactly what I was kind of hoping for, is this grip. So it takes knight h3. After a very long think, I ended up deciding on this move rook to e1. There was a lot that went into this. We'll get into the details, but basically like g3, gh3, none of these moves were satisfying. So eventually I played rook e1 with the idea that I'm kind of preparing g3. So if black returns with the knight, then I want a g3 here. And then it's kind of awkward for black. Like if the knight goes to h5, knight fg5, bishop h3, like this is the kind of play that white is looking for in this position. Instead, and I should say the interesting thing here is like I spent a ton of time on this move, so I was like down on the clock, so really in some trouble. I was like down to like 30 minutes against an hour and 5 or so, and then my opponent at this point spends 45 minutes on his next move. So he was like up like half an hour on the clock, and then he spends so much time that he ends up lower than me. And he plays this move bishop to g4. He had a lot of options as well. I don't blame him for spending so much time, but he ends up playing bishop to g4, which at first glance like looks like a blunder, because he's putting pressure on the knight, but I have this move knight h2. And after I go knight h2, the bishop is going to hang and the knight on h3 is going to hang. And so black is going to have 2 pieces under attack. So I took some time, because I mean, he's a strong player. He's not going to like think for 45 minutes and just hang a piece. And then I realized what his idea was. Honestly, couldn't believe it with my eyes. But then I figured, well, there's no way he's playing for anything else. And so, yeah, eventually I realized, okay, I have to go knight h2. I understood what he wanted here was to take on f2 and start sacrificing material. But from white's point of view, there's not really much else I can do except allow the sacrifice and try to survive. So he takes, knight takes f2. He goes rook takes f2. I already understood this was his plan going into this line with bishop to g4. This is what he spent the 45 minutes on. Queen takes f2, and now bishop f5 check. And here you can see black's point is that he's going to get e4 in next move. He finally opens up this bishop on g7, which has been suffering. The queen comes out to f6, and he sacrifices a whole rook, but he just gets a ton of attacking play against my king. So really insane idea. Actually, I should mention Jesse on this channel made a video on this game because he was just so impressed by Victor's idea. So it's one of the very few videos I think he's made on one of my games. But if you're interested, he explained it, you know, from his perspective. He was doing commentary on the game as this was happening. So he had a very kind of unique take on it as well. But yeah, definitely check out that video. Yeah, during the game, obviously I was quite scared here at this point. Knowing my opponent is a really, really strong attacking player, very, very dynamic. But again, I felt like I had kind of no choice after bishop g4. If I don't go knight h2, I don't really know what my next move is. At this point, I have two choices, either king c1 or king b2. Apparently, king c1 was holding on, although this followed by queen f6 looked dangerous to me, but engine says queen d2 and king d1, and apparently white is okay. Black has at least a draw, and not more than that. Draw would be absolutely fine for me in terms of the result. But yeah, that to me looked very scary, so I ended up deciding on king b2 and king a3. So I felt like I wasn't quite seeing how my king was going to get checkmated here. Because if queen f6, I thought I would have queen d2, and then g4 is coming. And yeah, there's no clear follow from black. But instead he goes a4, which like totally shocked me because it's not every day your opponent is down a full rook and they're just making this like quiet pawn move in front of your king, and you don't have time to really defend. But now I realized, okay, now black wants c6, queen a5, and queen b4, and this kind of mate, as well as queen f6. So I realized things are getting very dangerous. At this point, I'm very low on time. Or not super low, I had like 10 minutes, but not enough time to figure out a position like this. I end up going g4. A bit regrettable. I really should have just brought the queen over first and then played g4 later. But yeah, I started with g4, just looking for an aggressive counterattacking move. And now comes bishop c3, just like, which completely, shocked me once again. I just wasn't expecting this kind of move. But if I take on f5, then queen f6 is the point. And black's idea is to mate with bishop to b4. And I actually just don't have a good defense to this. Queen c5, then there's bishop b2. And queen c3. And if I go rook to b1, then there's either bishop b2 or bishop b4. Either one works. Takes, queen c3, rook b3, a b3, and mate on the a file. So some really, really like nasty, nasty checkmates in the position. I have to go rook to b1. Now black plays queen f6, threatening the same mating ideas. And at this point, I have to defend against this. My main thought, of course, was queen c2, just like bringing the queen closer to the king. But then I got very afraid of the line queen d4, g takes f5, queen e3. And to me, this basically just looked like I'm getting mated, like bishop to b4 and a3 is coming. And yeah, black has all kinds of like checks here. And it turns out that like I'm actually fine if I find the move rook to d1. Actually, white is winning. I have like bishop d3 is an idea. So basically, I'm just planning on bringing the bishop to d3. I give my king a square on b1, and it turns out there's actually no mate. So during the game, I didn't spot this. In panicking, thinking I'm losing after queen to c2, I decided to go queen to g3, which I felt like, okay, also covers the c3 square, so there's no bishop b4 check, but now I don't have to deal with queen d4, queen e3. But this move is a problem because I'm very far away from my king, and now black finds very nice move e3, where he opens up the bishop against my rook, and of course he renews the threat, bishop b4, rook takes b4, queen c3, and I'm getting mated. So I take the pawn, nothing else to do. Now black could take the rook and allow me to go into this endgame with queen e6 check, take. But this endgame actually would be, I think, still very, very good for black. I believe it's just like winning objectively. I don't think from a human's perspective it's like that easy of a win. But yeah, black's two bishops are still very, very strong here. And Yeah, this would already be good for black, but instead my opponent finds just another incredible move, b6. And when I saw b6, I was like, because in the game, I thought his idea was actually to go bishop b4 check, where I'm forced to take, and then queen b2. I thought we might get into this, where white's king looks extremely unsafe, and black is only down a piece here, and he's still hunting the king, like b6 check, queen f6. I was like trying to calculate this, and I thought for sure, like, I should be getting mated here, like king b7, queen d8, queen c8. I thought, and it should be mate. I mean, I don't know if it's mate here, like takes. I still have the c6 square, but it just looked incredibly dangerous. But yeah, then when b6 came, I was just like stunned. I was like, oh my God, he wants bishop b4 check, and then he wants to just mate me on b2 without allowing my king to move forward. And amazingly, I don't have a way to stop this threat. Like I can't get my pieces out. My pieces just can't do anything to cover any key squares. So kind of incredible. I have no moves here. I also, of course, have to deal with the continual threat of like bishop b2 followed by queen to c3. So yeah, it's just over. I play queen c1 is just the only move not to resign. Bishop takes b1. And then I resign because now bishop b4 is the next move. If I take bishop b4 anyway, I have to give up my queen and I'm getting mated. So it's just over. So rather unfortunate game for me. I mean, brilliant game for my opponent. Afterwards, I congratulated him on his creative achievement because it was an incredible rook sack. Like this whole idea starting with bishop to g4, just like super creative and like phenomenal idea to get the two bishops and then like basically trap the king on a3 and then have all these ideas of like bishop c3 and c6 and so on. And of course I could have defended better, but sometimes your opponent plays like a genius and there's only so much you can do. So I'm not too regretful about how I failed to defend the position after the sacrifice. I think that was really hard to do. Of course, I could have done better. I am regretful that I didn't find the move knight d2 here, which is like a pretty straightforward move in these positions. And, I was considering and I could have spent more time on, but that's how it goes. So unfortunately, that was my first loss of the tournament. Now I would be on 4 out of 5 heading into the second half. So going into round 6, I was actually paired down again, playing a 2100 rated player, I believe from Portugal. And this game actually got into heavy trouble out of the opening. It was a Sicilian. And I was very lucky just to save this game. We reached this end game. I'm already down a pawn as black. My opponent's last move, I think, was g3, hitting the rook. And I played rook f3. And at this point, actually, white has a straightforward win with rook takes b7. With the idea that he wants to come down to the 7th rank with rook c7 and then take on h7 and give mate. And unfortunately for black, there's actually no way to comfortably deal with this threat. If I take on f2, like this tactic, this is a key point because I think this is what my opponent might have missed, is that at the end, white has rook f7 or bishop f7, I think, but rook f7 is easiest to cover against this tactic. And then black is going to end up down a piece in the end. So rook takes f2 doesn't work. And if I do something like bishop to d4, like looking for counterplay, white can just ignore it. Just go rook c7, go ahead and take on f2, king g2, and game over. I can't defend the h7 pawn. I'm just getting mated. So I think I could play rook f6, rook c7, and rook g6 as a way not to just immediately resign, but I think it's basically over here. I'd be 2 pawns down and white can just take here. I'd be 3 pawns down. I still can't move my bishop because h7, and so this would just be basically unplayable. So rook takes b7 would have essentially ended the game. Instead, white played bishop to g4. So huge gift for me. Basically, I think my opponent just missed like that he doesn't have to worry about rook f2 because of rook f7. In the current position, rook f2 followed bishop d4 is dealt with just with rook c2, so that's why white might want to keep the rook on c7. But yeah, this was quite a break. After bishop g4, I go back. We end up trading one pair of rooks. I think rook c4 would have given white a big advantage. So takes, bishop e6, rook f8. And now I feel like a lot more comfortable, even though I'm still down a pawn. White still has a big advantage, but I feel like I'm much closer to possibly holding this one. So bishop drops back to b6 here, king g2, king g7. Apparently the engine wanted bishop h3 here, and the idea is that if black ever goes e3 to just push f4. Play this position like bishop e6, f5, g4, and I could see that being winning for white. It would just an eventual exchange sacrifice on e3 and white just having full domination over everything. But okay, we saw king g2, king g7, g4. Now looking for bishop f5, so I feel like my move is forced. h5, white goes h3. If takes, then I thought rook f4, and yeah, I felt like black is kind of just holding here. Nice little fortress. With white having 2 extra pawns on the h-file that, yeah, hard to really use. So h3 takes, and long story short, I ended up saving this one. And yeah, here draw was agreed. But very, very lucky for me. Although, yeah, the draw was not a good result overall. Definitely hurts the rating, but I ended up saving it from a pretty bad position. So after round 6, I was on 4.5 out of 6. Going into round 7, I was playing white against a high-rated player now, this time 2180. Someone who had been over 2200, so definitely a strong player from the Netherlands. And yeah, I'll take you guys to the critical moment here. This was definitely one of my biggest mistakes of the whole tournament. I had this position as white. I realized my opponent was looking to play on the king side with moves like f4, and so I spent a long time thinking here, trying to figure out like what to do. Do I play on the queen side, knight c4, a4, a5, and try to break through before I get checkmated on the king side? I realized that was too slow, as well as any kind of like b4 or c4 ideas didn't seem to be working. Eventually I understood that like I just need to bring my queen back to d3, and then on f4 to meet this with g4. I feel like here actually it'd be hard for black to break through on the king side, because if rook g6, I can go h3, and black can't play h5 because of this queen on d3. So that's why I thought bringing the queen to d3 was kind of critical. And here it's just hard for black to organize counterplay. In the meantime, I got like knight c4, knight e5 coming, can improve my king, I can push a4, a5 as well. And I thought white is doing well, but of course I was nervous because I didn't want to open up my king too much. And if h5 here, then g5 would be the idea, and then king h1, rook g1, and so on. So once we got this on the board, I started thinking, and then I changed my mind. I ended up playing c4. And after c4, knight b4, queen e4, this was my idea. I felt like this was stronger than just playing g4 right away, because here I thought this is more active. I might be threatening d5, might be threatening a3 as well, and his knights are just kicked to nowhere land, and d5 is coming. But yeah, I totally underestimated the counterplay here, because here black goes f takes g3, I go h takes g3, and now queen f7. And like, all of a sudden I realized like, wait, like f3 is hanging. My queen is also awkward because black wants to play d5 and then look for knight c2. And all of a sudden I realized like I'm in huge danger here. Like everything is hanging on the f file, and what do I do? If I go rook e3, then there's d5, takes, and then pawn takes. So I totally underestimated this move, queen f7, because without queen f7, d5 is not really scary. I'm taking on d5, and black has to take with the knight because of the pin. After queen f7, all of a sudden this guy is hanging. If I go king g2, then d5 again. And I can't stay in contact with both the knight and the c2 square. And if I go knight to g5, which I might have thought like, oh, well, knight g5 should be good enough, but then black is playing either queen h5 or queen g6. I think both are reasonable, because he's hitting the knight, and then if takes, rook takes, he's hitting the knight, and again, he's hitting c2, he's hitting d4 as well. Everything is just hanging in my position. So all of a sudden I realized like after queen f7, I'm in huge trouble. And I ended up not being able to hold this one. I think the engine gives like rook e3, d5, takes queen b1, and it says that white isn't necessarily losing, although black is much better here, like queen h5, rook h6 is coming. So yeah, I didn't really consider this too seriously. but there's really nothing else. I ended up playing d5 because I just wanted to stop black from playing d5, but of course black can take. He takes the pawn, queen takes d5, knight takes d5. Now black is a pawn up, and he still has tons of pressure on the f-file. And yeah, I don't really have a good defense here. King g2, knight d4, and everything is collapsing. So takes, rook f2 is coming, followed by rook takes d2. And yeah, he's 2 pawns up there. So I tried rook e5, but now knight b4, a3. Basically, black just has too many threats now. What I was hoping for with rook e5 is, yeah, if he takes on f3, then I would take on d5. And some endgame like this, where I'm down a pawn, like rook endgame, this, okay, I could try to defend. I think this would be hard to win. But yeah, with knights on the board, and he's very active, he's likely to win a second pawn. So knight b4 is much stronger. I went a3, he goes back knight c6, and now it's over because my rook is hit, the knight on f3 is still hanging. So if I move my rook anywhere, he's just taking on f3. I can go rook e3 as I did in the game, but then knight c2 is just game over. So I give the exchange, knight d4 again happens, and rook e3 takes on f3, takes, and I resign here because now he's trading everything off, going into the king and pawn endgame, which is a very easy win for black with extra pawn. So really rough game for me, and it ended up just like being lost in 2 moves basically when I played c4, and then h takes g3 was a critical mistake. Had I seen queen f7 was the opponent's idea, then I hopefully would have found f takes g3. After queen f7, I can defend this one with rook f1, for example. I don't know if this is best. I think the engine is like giving a3 here, and some lines like d5, this takes, and black is down the exchange, has enough, has a draw if they want, but not more, and then white would be okay. So I would at least not lose the game, I think, if I find f takes g3. But c4 was already, c4 was the first mistake, hg, second mistake. Really unfortunate. Yeah, I should have played g4 as was like my initial intention, and then I think white has an advantage. I'd be doing fine. Somehow I talked myself out of it, thinking c4 is more active. But yeah, huge mistake, and basically just overlooking the opponent's counterplay with queen f7 was my feeling on the cause of this one. But yeah, that was rather rough because this loss effectively kind of spoiled my tournament. Losing to a low rated player always just like kills your performance rating. But what to do? After this one, I was on 4.5 out of 7, hoping to finish strong. Going to round 8, I was playing black against another lower rated player. This game, I wasn't necessarily winning the whole time, but I felt pretty comfortable, like I was in control. We had a King's Indian. It was a knight f3, bishop g5 variation. Eventually we reached the middle game like this, where I had the bishop pair, nice dark squared bishop. I thought this was a nice moment just to share with you guys. At this point, I thought I liked my position here, but I felt like white has some ideas to create some counterplay. And in particular, I realized they want to go g4 at some point. My first thought I was thinking was like queen e7, with the idea to go knight d5, queen e5, and I kind of like this construction with the queen on e5, but then I realized queen e7, white could play g4, kind of annoying, and then the e-pawn is under pressure. So the nuance I realized was I could try queen e8, and I ended up playing this in the game with the point that if g4 now, I can meet this with f4. And the tactical idea is that queen takes e4, bishop takes e3 is winning a piece for black. And my queen on e8 is defended, not on e7. That's the key difference. And then after takes, I'm hitting the bishop on e2. So I was quite happy to find this nuance, stopping g4. White ends up playing knight d5 anyway. I go queen e5, and now I got like the position I wanted. Queen d4, I went knight to b6, and yeah, this endgame ends up being, I thought, a little bit better for black, and white could have held a draw with best play, but it really wasn't so easy. So I'll just show you guys what happened. c5, knight a4, white takes on c8, rook c8, rook d7, check, rook f7, rook fd1, very logical. I go rook c7, takes, bishop b5, I grab on c5, we end up trading knights, rook d7 check, king f6, rook takes b7, bishop d4, and here I think white's position was already losing. Despite material equality, and we have an endgame with opposite color bishops, black's kingside majority, and then the threat of rook c2 is just way too strong, and white's kingside is collapsing. So like bishop e8, I gave check, takes here, and yeah, black's play was just way too strong. B4, rook b1, check, f4, and white resigned here as he's getting mate at g takes f4, I'm pushing g3, and then bishop is moving next. Otherwise, I'm taking here, and yeah, he just has no defense against this idea. So it's kind of like, maybe feels like an abrupt finish, but yeah, actually, like when I'd played knight b6, I was already kind of anticipating we might get knight e7 because it's very logical for white. You hit g6, you hit the bishop, but I felt like this endgame would be a little bit better for black. White did have a way to concretely defend, like I think takes, bishop b5 would have been holding for white with the idea of knight c5, rook c1, and then eventually taking on c5. So something like this, like if b6, knight c5, either I trade rooks and that would be a draw, or bc5, bishop d7, and then white can take on f5. So there was some concrete way for white to make a draw, but for the most part, I felt I was in pretty reasonable control in this game, and I was happy with the win. So that brings me to 5.5 points out of 8 going into the final round, round 9. Had I won this final round, I felt like it would have been a reasonable tournament for me. I ended up getting a nice position out of the opening. We actually got into this endgame where I have the two bishops and nice play against the a-file. But at this moment, which I felt like kind of was a critical moment, I didn't choose the right plan, and it ended up not making the most out of my chances. Might be an instructive moment for you guys if you want to pause the video, think about what you would play here. It might be interesting for you to compare your thoughts with my thoughts, and then what the computer thinks. But anyways, so yeah, I was definitely focused on this a pawn here. I decided to play bishop d4, just kind of going after the pawn with the idea of pushing b5 and then doubling rooks on the a-file and eventually taking it. I thought it's very unpleasant for black, but it ended up being not so easy. Rook b8, b5, knight c5, and yeah, black ends up getting a lot of counterplay, just like with knight to b3, and eventually his knight's kind of jumping around, like this knight going back to d7, knight to d6, the rook on b7, and going after the b pawn. So I go rook a3, f6. I'll just show you guys what happened. Rook d1, rook b7, knight e1, playing for f3. But now black goes back with the knight d7, making space. So if f3, then he can come back either knight c5 or knight d6, and then go after the b pawn. So I go rook a1 here, knight b6, rook back to c1. And this is why I start moving back and forth, because like I couldn't figure out how to break through here. And now I realize black wants ideas like bishop c4 or knight c4. So I was like, oh, I gotta go rook c1, knight d6, I go rook a6, rook c8, rook back to a1, e5, and at this point I take on b6, pawn takes, and yeah, I realize that, basically have spoiled all my advantage. I did try rook to d1 here, but bishop to c4, black is in time and not losing material. So eventually, pretty soon this game was drawn. Going back the way, there's a couple ways I could have gotten the advantage here. One, after the way I played on f6, instead of rook d1, what I should have done actually was just give up the bishop pair here, take on c5, knight c5, bring my knight to d4, and here white would have a nice advantage, like my rook is coming to c1. If e5, I have knight f5, and black's pieces are a little bit loose, and black is still kind of tied down with this b pawn, the a pawn is weak. So here white would have a clear edge, I think something like 0.8 or something according to the engine. But also the other way I could have gotten a bigger advantage was instead of bishop to d4 to play knight d4. So just bringing the knight to d4 earlier, that was kind of the key lesson from this game. So number one, I do kind of allow myself to play for like f3, e4, which is like a very typical improvement here. But also what Compi wants after rook b8 is to go knight b5. To bring the knight to b5 where I'm threatening like knight c7 stuff. Also f3 and like I'm covering the d6 square. So apparently this was quite nice for white, like white gets a big advantage. Okay, this one I didn't see, but there was other ways to play as well, like f3 here as well, I think would be nice for white, and then rook to d1. In addition to knight d4, I think I could have played b5 and then 95. This also would have been nice for white, trading off a pair of knights, and then again getting this f3, e4. So this f3, e4, getting this in quickly was really kind of the key to this position. So yeah, in this one, unfortunately, I had a good opening, but then missed my chance to really capitalize on the advantage, and then we ended up making a draw. So that kind of concludes my tournament. I ended up with 6 points out of 9, which it seems like a pretty reasonable score, but considering I played most of my games against low-rated players, then I definitely could have done better. I ended up with a performance rating of 2292 and losing 2.7 FIDE rating points according to chessresults.com. So a bit of a shame because I started with 4 out of 4 in the tournament. I was like doing great, beat a GM with black, playing next day with white. Everything was going well. I lost this game to Mikhalevski. I honestly didn't feel so horrible after that game. I felt like my opponent played really well, deserved the win. But then clearly after that, my tournament completely tanked. I made a draw against a low-rated player. Then I lost the game with white against a low-rated player. And then I made another draw in the final round and ended up kind of, giving away all of my gains in the first few games. So yeah, definitely a bummer. A big takeaway for me was that I wasn't playing super precise in the tournament. Even the games that I won, there were games where I got lucky. I only won because my opponents made mistakes and blundered from good positions. But earlier, I was like giving them chances and getting into worse situations. Definitely had like several miscalculations and moments where like I just missed the opponent's ideas, the opponent's counterplay. And so, yeah, I feel like this tournament showed a lot of my typical weaknesses that I've been thinking a lot about these days, mainly weaknesses related to calculation as well as converting positions. I felt like my technique also wasn't great in this event, spoiling some nice positions. So yeah, wasn't the worst tournament. Definitely some highlights as well. I played some good games. I had some nice moments, but definitely a lot of mistakes, a lot of calculation errors, and stuff to work on, stuff to improve. So my next tournament that I ended up playing in Italy a week later ended up going much better. I look forward to recapping that event for you guys in a future video. But yeah, for now, that's going to do it. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the analysis, enjoyed the recap. If you did, please leave a comment down below, leave a thumbs up on the video as well. But otherwise, I will hopefully catch you in the next one. Take care.